Okay, hello everybody. We're doing chapter 19 today, continuing on the concepts of an open economy. We're going to be talking about net exports, net capital outflow, and the effects on the exchange rate. So before diving into this chapter, if you're feeling a little unsure about these concepts, I do recommend that you look at the chapter 18 videos first, or maybe go over the stuff in the notes before we go into chapter 19, because a lot of the concepts from chapter 18 will show up here. So we need to make sure that we know them pretty well. Okay, so we're talking about an open economy, what determines the real interest rate and the exchange rate. How do these things get determined? We're going to look at the markets for loanable funds and foreign currency exchange rates. And we're going to see how budget deficits affect the trade balance and other policies can affect the interest rate. So we're going to build a model for examining aggregate demand and aggregate supply is what we're calling them today, and how different government policies from trade or fiscal or monetary policy can affect those. So let's start by saying that an economy's real GDP is given, kind of given exogenously, meaning that it's not determined day to day. It's kind of determined by the factors in production available, and the type of technology, the type of human capital, the type of physical capital available in the economy, and that determines the real GDP. Price level is also given, and it's also given to it's given in a sense that it adjusts to bring the supply and demand for money into balance. So that means that given some output, right, given some a GDP, Y, that's determined by the amount of technology and the factors of production, the price level adjusts to bring the supply and demand of money into balance. So we're going to talk about a model that figures out how to think of these things. How are we determining the interest rate, the exchange rate, net exports, so on and so forth. And we have to focus on two particular markets. The first one is going to be the market for loanable funds. We've talked about that before, which essentially means the markets for debt, for funds that are loanable. And then we're also going to look at the market for foreign currency exchange. So first of all, let's remember ourselves that savings equals investment plus net capital outflow. This is an equation that we did in chapter 18, and what this is saying is that, well, our national savings, which is both private and public saving, can go into two places. One, we can do in domestic investment, or two, we can buy capital outside of the country. We can buy German capital, Japanese capital, so on and so forth, just something that's not in the US or not domestic. So the supply of loanable funds, the supply of debt, the supply of cash that's available for investment or purchases overseas, well, that comes from national savings, right? And then the demand for that savings, for that money, can go to either domestic investment. I'd like to open up a donut shop or a burger joint in the US, or I'd like to purchase some German or Japanese assets abroad. Okay, now that's a demand for these loanable funds. The supply comes from savings. So we know that when NCO is greater than zero, that means that we're buying capital overseas. That means that we're sending over dollars to Germany and buying some of their German assets. And vice versa, when NCO is less than zero, that means that we're selling off American assets, and the rest of the world are buying American assets. Okay, so here we've got the real interest rate as a return on domestic assets. And notice what happens when we decrease the real interest rate. When we do that, NCO increases. The reason being is because a fall in R makes domestic assets less attractive relative to foreign assets. Why is that? Well, we're saying that assets in the US used to return 5% per year, and now they only return 2% per year. And if that's the case, people in the US will purchase more foreign assets. No one wants to hold American assets because they used to pay 5, now they pay 2. No one wants to hold American assets, so that means that we're going to go and purchase foreign assets. And also, people abroad purchase fewer U.S. assets. That means the Germans and the Japanese don't really want to buy American assets anymore. So they're not really buying American assets. So NCO rises. NCO rises. That means that Americans are going to now buy a lot of other assets, a lot of German or Japanese assets, and no one is going to buy American assets. So that means that NCO increases. We no one wants to buy American assets because they give such a low rate of return. It used to return 5, now only returns 2. Yuck. Let's get rid of it, and then we go and we buy something else. All right, so let's look at the loanable funds. So this is going to be, again, loanable fund could be thought of as just debt, right? And you can think of debt as a function of R, the interest rate. If the interest rate is low, let's look at the supply curve first. If the interest rate is low, only producing 1%, then the quantity supplied to debt, to your saving, will be low because it only produces 2% per year. That's nothing. I'm not going to really save that much. However, if the real interest rate was, say, 20% per year, then your saving will be quite high. That's why we have an upward sloping supply curve for saving as a function of the interest rate. And then also on the other side, demand, which is two components: investment, right, domestic investment, or I want to buy foreign assets, which is NCO. So that's demand can be kind of cut up into two pieces: the domestic piece and a foreign piece. And that's going to be changing with the interest rate as well. When R is very, very high, the interest rate is really, really high, well, that means that your demand for loans is really, really low because, well, I just charge you 15% for a 1-year loan. That's quite high, and maybe you won't demand a lot of that because the interest rate is so high. But vice versa, if I gave you a really low interest rate, maybe 3% for a year, then your demand will be quite high at that interest rate. And that's why demand is downward sloping in general. And the intersection of these two curves give us the equilibrium interest rate that balances supply and demand. Where supply perfectly equal demand, everyone goes home happy. Okay, so R adjust to balance supply and demand, we know that. All right, so let's see how a budget deficit can affect NCO and can affect the exchange rate. So let's look at some other stuff. So first of all, we're going to assume that a budget deficit reduces saving and the supply of loanable funds, causing R to rise. So here we have a decrease in supply. Why did we have a decrease in supply? Well, because the government is now running a budget deficit. A budget deficit means that there's less money available for the government to lend out, and they're going to take away from the supply of loanable funds. So that means if there's less money available to be lent out because now the government is running a budget deficit, that causes an increase in the equilibrium interest rate. Interest rate rise to equilibrate supply and demand. So by shifting the supply curve to the left, we shifted the supply curve to the left because the government is running a budget deficit. The government's running a budget deficit. That means that there's no excess cash to be lent out. So that's why we have a reduction in the supply, and that increased the interest rate. And at that interest rate, now we can take this new interest rate all the way over to the net capital outflow graph. And we know that that's just a downward sloping NCO graph. And we're going to say, well, now at this new interest rate, R2, and note, this R2, by the way, was determined by this market over here, by the loanable funds market. We had a change here. It determined this new R2. And then we just took this R2 and we said, okay, well, now this is our new R2 over here. What happens to NCO? And what we find is that a higher R makes U.S. bonds more attractive relative to foreign bonds and reduces NCO. So that means that now that the U.S. assets are returning a higher rate of return, it used to be maybe 3%, now it's 8%. Wow, 8% is pretty good. As a result, I may purchase some more U.S. assets and less of foreign assets, and that reduces my net capital outflow. That means that I'm not buying foreign assets anymore, Japanese assets. I'm buying American assets, and that's why NCO is less. And you can see that here by increasing the real interest rate from 1 to 2 over here, and that was determined by this market over here. We saw a reduction in NCO, and that means that we don't want to buy foreign assets anymore. We want to buy American assets because American assets produce such a high rate of return, and thus NCO is reduced. Okay, so keep in mind that here, this loanable funds market really determines the R, right? And the R gets fed into the net capital outflow graph. So this market determines the interest rate, and the interest rate is kind of fed into as given into this graph over here. Okay, so this value determines NCO in the right graph. Now, there's actually one more thing that we need to determine in these graphs. So we just saw two of them here. There's actually a third one, and it's going to be the net exports graph. Now, how I'd like you to draw these, actually, I find it useful to draw loanable funds and net capital outflow to the right. And I think it's best to draw the net exports graph, which you'll see in just a minute, right below the net capital outflow graph. So it would be three graphs, 1, 2, and then below the NCO graph, I'd like you to draw this new graph that we're going to be looking at, which is the next exports graph. So it'll kind of exist somewhere down here and it'll look exactly the same. So it'll be like a little Tetris piece that's like an inverted L almost. You got 1, 2, and then under the NCO graph is your net exports graph. And you'll see why that's useful in just a minute. Okay, so let's talk about net exports. We know from last chapter that net exports equal net capital outflow. So we say that net exports is the demand for dollars that foreigners need to buy U.S. net exports. So if this is positive, net exports is positive, that means exports minus imports is positive. That means that exports is greater than imports. That means that the foreign market needs to find some dollars to buy these U.S. exports, and that's why NX is positive. And that's the same concept of NCO. If we're saying that net exports is positive, that means that there needs to be some supply of dollars that the U.S. are selling some dollars in order to buy some foreign assets. So if the US is buying German and Japanese assets, that means that they need to fork over some dollars, right? They need to increase the supply of dollars right here in order to buy euros or Japanese yen so that we can buy some of their foreign assets. Now that means that in order for us to buy Japanese assets or German assets, we need to exchange some dollars. We supply some dollars and we go and we buy these foreign assets. Now, the dollars that we've just supplied in order to buy foreign assets are used to buy US net exports. They're used to buy Apple computers and Tesla cars and so on and so forth. So that's why these two things are equal, because how else would the rest of the world find money or find dollars in order to buy the US goods like Apple computers and so on and so forth without a supply of dollars? There's just no way that Germans will be able to buy any American assets without having access to US dollars first, because everything is priced in dollars. And where are they going to find those dollars? Well, they're going to need to essentially exchange some of their German assets in exchange for American assets. They're going to say, well, here are maybe some German, some euros, some currency, maybe some stocks, some bonds, whatever, any foreign assets that the rest of the world can offer the US in exchange for the supply of dollars. Okay, so that's why these two things are equal. All right, so let's not forget that we still also have the real exchange rate, and the real exchange rate, since it's real, it measures the quantity of foreign goods and services that trade for US goods and services. So these two things there's no prices here. It's all in quantities. And that's why it's because it's a real exchange rate, not a nominal exchange rate. If it was a nominal exchange rate, we can just talk about how many pesos do I need to exchange for a dollar and so on and so forth. But if it's a real exchange rate, then we'd look at real goods. So quantities of foreign goods and services that trade for each other. E is the real value of a dollar in the market for foreign currency exchange. And E balances the supply and demand for foreign currency. So what this is saying is that the exchange rate balances supply and demand for foreign currency exchange. So think of the supply of dollars and the demand for dollars. And the exchange rate is essentially the price that balances these two things. It's going to be what we see on our y-axis, and we'll see that in just a minute. Actually, here we are, yes. So here we've got our net exports on the x-axis, and then exchange rate on the y-axis. And we're going to say that, well, before we go here, notice that when the exchange rate is very, very high, net exports is quite low. And the reason being is because, well, the dollar is very expensive. The exchange rate is quite high. In order for me to exchange my pesos or my euros, in order to get some dollars, and then purchase some US goods, well, the exchange rate is so high that I wouldn't be able to buy many goods because it's all going into the exchange rate. Vice versa, if the exchange rate was quite low, then my net exports would be quite high. The reason being is because, well, I can trade my dollars in for 1,000 or 2,000 of this other currency, and as a result, I have a lot of it, and then therefore I'll demand a high amount of exports because the exchange rate is so low. So that, just to kind of make sure that this graph makes sense from a net exports and exchange rate point of view, is that when the exchange rate is high, my net exports is low because no one wants to buy something from an expensive country, but vice versa, when the exchange rate is low and I feel very wealthy when I exchange my dollars into some other currency, well, that means that net exports will go up, or that I'm going to buy a lot of that stuff. Or vice versa. Think of when the U.S. exchange rate is low and Europeans can buy dollars at a very, very cheap rate. Well, they will do that, and then they'll go and they'll buy a lot of Apple computers or Tesla cars, so on and so forth, or American goods in general. Okay, so let's see where the NCO graph comes in. So that's going to be a vertical graph, and the reason being is because, well, the supply of dollars does not change with the exchange rate. The demand for dollars definitely does, and we just talked about how demand or net exports does change with the exchange rate, but the supply of dollars does not care. It's invariant to the exchange rate. If the exchange rate was quite high or quite low, the supply of dollars does not really care, only the demand side. And to think about it, if the exchange rate was high or was low, the supply of dollars wouldn't really change at all. And it's kind of determined by other factors, as you'll see. So an increase in E has no effect on S or I, so it does not affect NCO. NCO is going to be our saving and investment, of course. So let's not forget that. We'll see that in just a minute. But what E does balance, if we consider our NCO is going to be the supply of dollars available, and net exports is going to be the demand for dollars, then E is going to be the exchange rate that just pins those two things down and equilibrates supply with demand, and everyone walks away happy. So let's back up for just a second. Remember why, first of all, demand for dollars is going to be determined by net exports, because before Japanese or Germans buy American computers or American cars, well, they're going to need American dollars. So that's why this demand is a net exports right here, because whenever Japanese or Germans want to buy American goods, well, first they need to have American dollars in order to do that. The second thing is that, well, where those American dollars are going to come from? Well, they're going to come from net capital outflow. Americans first need to be able to want to purchase other assets or exchange some of those dollars for other assets, such as German stocks or bonds, or Japanese stocks or bonds, so that the Germans and Japanese can have dollars to buy net exports to begin with. So that's why these two things make sense from a practical point of view. That, well, first of all, the rest of the world demands dollars so they can buy goods, and the supply of dollars is going to come from Americans willing to exchange some dollars for other goods or other capital, like German stocks or bonds. Okay, so let's take an example. So we're going to say that Shimar, a U.S. resident and business owner, buys cars made in Germany. So how does this affect the foreign exchange market? So we can look at it this two ways. So first of all, if we're buying cars made in Germany, that means that Shimar is going to be exchanging dollars to buy some euros so that this person can go and buy the German car. All right, so that means that the supply of dollars increases. So you can think of here, this would be an increase in NCO. Right, so number one is going to be an increase in NCO. Or we can think of the other way of thinking about it is going to be that the demand for dollar decreases. Demand for dollar decreases because we're buying now a car from Germany. So that means that net exports is reduced, right? Because we're importing now, right? I increases, so that reduces NX, and we have a shift left in NX. So that means that we have a reduction in X. So notice that both of these views are equivalent, right? So we're going to say that either NCO increases, right? That was scenario number one, and that would bring our exchange rate down. Okay, so that's going to be one way of thinking of it. The other way of thinking of it is that um, the demand curve shifted left, right? D or NX shifted left, and that gave us the same result, a decrease in E. So if you can think of a shift in the demand curve left, what would that happen? We'd have a new exchange rate over here. So no matter which way you think of it, right? When you think of it, number one or number one is an increase in NCO, number two is a decrease in NX. Both come out to the same result. Okay, so we can think of this again. Let's say that, well, we can think of a French business owner who buys wine made in the U.S. for her French restaurants. So we can again think of this two ways. One, the demand for dollar increases. This is going to be an NX story. Well, because we're selling American wine to the French, that means that exports go up, right? The foreigner needs dollars in order to purchase the U.S. assets, so demand for dollars increases, so net exports increased. Or you can think of it as a supply of dollars falls, or NCO falls. The reason why NCO falls, well, because the French business owner needs now to soak up some of those dollars so that she can buy this wine made in the U.S. Okay, so here we can think of that NCO is really the net supply of dollars, right? Once we already take out what everyone's trying to do, what remains from all those transactions is really what NCO is. And again, both views are equivalent. Whether we can say that NCO decreased or NX increased, same result comes out in terms of exchange rate. All right, so let's look at what the example, or let's look at what a budget deficit would do to the interest rate, would do to NCO, and would do to exchange rate. So we're going to say that initially a budget is balanced and trade is balanced as well, so NX equals 0. So let's remember, what's the difference between a government budget and a trade budget? Well, government budget is going to be the difference between taxes and government spending, G and T. And then trade is going to be the difference between exports and imports. So suppose the government runs a budget deficit. As we saw earlier, R rises and NCO falls. So how does this affect the exchange rate and the balance of trade? Okay, so in this example, this is linked to this example over here that we looked at right here. Okay, so this is kind of extending that story. We said, remember here, look, a budget deficit reduces savings. So that means that we had a shift left in the supply curve, which increased R over here, and that determined a new NCO, which was this. It used to be NCO used to be over here, and now it's a less net capital outflow over here. Okay, so this example is extending that idea. So now we're going to say, well, what does that now have to do with the exchange rate? Okay, so now we saw that NCO decreased, right? Remember, this is now why I told you to draw the loanable funds graph over here, and then the NCO graph over here. And then now we have this third graph under the NCO graph. And the reason being is because now you can start to see that if the NCO decreased, as we saw in the last example, you can kind of just bring that NCO downwards, kind of extending it. If it's just right up here and then the NCO is on the x-axis, and we saw a decrease in NCO from over here to over here, well, you can just kind of extend that downward and say, all right, well, NCO has now decreased from here to over here because you have the two graphs above you, right? Remember, you have the loanable funds graph up here, and then the NCO graph over here, and then under it is going to be this graph that we see over here. And having this graph right under the NCO graph makes this S1 to S2 very clear, because we know that NCO used to be at this level given the interest rate, but because the interest rate changed, NCO now is over here, and that means that it translates to down over right here instead of being over here. Okay, so if we have a decrease in NCO, don't forget, what is an NCO? It's going to be the supply of dollars. The supply of dollars has decreased into the foreign exchange market, and that's because of the budget deficit that we looked at. Now, what's going to happen here is we're going to see that, well, the exchange rate appreciates. Okay, the exchange rate increases, and that reduces net exports. Look at where net exports is. Net exports used to be over here because, let's not forget, NX equals NCO. So that means that N exports was right here, which was equal to NCO. But because NCO went down, well, NX went down too, because we know that NX equals NCO. But how does that happen? Well, that happened because the exchange rate went up. The exchange rate went up and reduced net exports. When the exchange rate went up, things got expensive in the US. No one wants to buy American goods because now they have to trade over more of their money in order to get some dollars just to exchange it into dollars. And as a result, the rest of the world isn't going to buy so much American goods because they're just more expensive. Okay, so a budget deficit causes a trade deficit because we started out with NX equals 0, and now because we've moved from here to here, we have a trade. We're going to have a trade deficit. We're going to have an NX less than 0 because we've had this change in the exchange rate. Okay. So here we can see that, right? Whenever we have a budget deficit increasing, net exports also, the deficit in net exports also increases. So you can see that these two things are symmetrical, more or less. Whenever we have an increase in the budget deficit, we have a decrease in net exports. And here in the example, we had a decrease in our deficit and an increase in our exports and so on and so forth. So these two things go in opposite directions. And we can see that from the example that we just did here. Remember, this whole example was showing that what would happen when the government runs a budget deficit. And this was a pretty long story that started with the loanable funds market up in the left corner, that moved over to the NCO market in the right corner, and then below the NCO market we had this third graph that we drew. So 3 graphs, and we saw that by tracing the effects from loanable funds, increase interest rate, change NCO, changes NX, and increases E over here. That ends the story, and we can see that a budget deficit does cause a trade deficit because NX did decrease because we started off at NX equals 0. If NX was equal to 0 over here, and we went to something less, then therefore NX definitely less than 0 over here, and then we cause a trade deficit. Okay. So let me stop here, and then we'll pick it up in the next video.